least when I remember to bring everything we do. Okay, so just kind of start by relaxing, and just gonna wait for him to give me the cue to start talking. Okay, we're good. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. And I like to start the meditation the same way every time, which is by giving you guys major kudos for showing up and being willing to do spiritual work. It's not always easy. Going inside and doing all this is definitely something. It's not the most encouraged in our world. Usually it's much more about trying to accomplish some sort of financial thing or all the busyness of life and trying to always accomplish external things versus realizing that the real important thing is ultimately our own consciousness, our own level of being and awareness. And that will ultimately determine, especially from a Buddhist or Hindu point of view, where you end up not only in this life, but in the next life. And so it's super important. And so today's talk is going to be on Dhamma, as we like to say, which is kind of the core of Buddhism, really. Is this idea of Dhamma. And there really is no singular definition of it. Basically, the word derives from something that basically means to like support. And then it's like also supposed to be a constant in a way, is kind of the way that more like Wikipedia defines it. But the way that I heard and the way that really always related to me is that Dhamma is the innermost principle of something. So whatever that innermost, deepest principle is, that's Dhamma. And that it grew from that. And it grew from that basically to mean everything from morality to your way of life. Because even when we talk about Dhamma, it includes usually the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path in Buddhism. And then, on the Hindu side, it usually tends to translate to like cosmic law. But I like Dhamma as basically being this one word principle that encompasses everything, is usually the way that I think about it. And for that reason, I think it has sort of parallels with even God, even though we wouldn't, especially in Buddhist terms, usually use the word God, because in Buddhism, they don't believe there's any sort of favoritism. So usually in the more Christian sense, there'd be a God. You can communicate with God. God will give you things, and there's some sort of transaction going on. But Buddhism sees it more as there's universal laws, and then we can align with certain laws, and then certain good things will happen to us. Or we can basically do things where we reject the laws and rebel against the nature of reality, and then we get the consequences of that. So it's very impersonal. There's no one that doesn't like you or like you. But I think there's also a Christian view of that too when you get into esoteric stuff. It's kind of funny, since I was raised Hindu, I never really had any sort of, a lot of people that come to Buddhism or even the Hinduism stuff a lot of times rejected the Christian stuff because they were raised in Christianity. And I'm not liking it, they get into Buddhism, that's wonderful and fine. But for me, since I came more from the Hindu side before, I could kind of see it a lot more as being more or less the same, but just with that difference. If you're just seeing it more as, instead of there being a subjective influence going on, if it's just there's principles, then that's basically, I think we're on the same page, because it's still considered the thing from which everything else springs. This innermost principle of reality is the thing that's the cause of why we have a reality in general. And then there's a lot of, like, even within the Buddhist stuff, because it can get a little bit more tricky, even though I'm trying to simplify it to a degree, because I think experientially understanding what Dhamma is, right? We're going within ourselves and trying to touch the innermost nature of ourselves. And this is trying to touch the Dhamma of ourselves. And there's levels of this Dhamma, levels of this truth, you could say, too. I think truth is another really good definition, not only for just, Dhamma, but also even for God, or just for what we're trying to pursue. The idea that there is a truth to reality, and that's worth pursuing, and that we are pursuing that, always made a lot of sense to me. And so, there's kind of like the Dhamma, it's understood that basically there's an individual Dhamma. So based off of our own innermost nature as an individual aspect of consciousness in this world, we're going to have a certain trajectory we're supposed to go on. And there's also certain different lineages, I believe, people even belong to. And this could be, not only the family lineage, but I also believe that there's spiritual lineages as well that are subtler, and that has its own Dhamma aspect. There's an innermost nature to that reality as well. And so you get sort of like this reality stacked on top of each other. There's a Dhamma to, I think, even the physical body. There's a truth to how it works, the laws in which it abides by. Then there's subtler realities and subtler realities and subtler realities. And I think ultimately you have to understand all that and beyond that to truly understand Dhamma as a whole concept, because it's a holistic concept and not really something that's to be divided up. If you understand Dhamma, it's basically done to say you understand all of nature, all of reality, and that, and then also the principle is that even at the core of our nature, as we go inside, is the same as the core of all nature, right? And you could view that also as consciousness, just to kind of maybe simplify it a little bit. Um, but but also in the Buddhist sense, it's supposed to be paradoxical, even in the Christian sense too, in the Hindu sense. I mean, God or Dhamma is supposed to be something beyond our immediate conception, something that's easy to understand, and that the true essence of this Dhamma, of our reality and who we are, is something that we have to basically purify our minds completely, so it's like clear water. So always we have all these ripples and all this stuff. So we constantly have, as I talked about last time, craving and aversion that's constantly creating ripples in the pond. And so if we want to see the true nature of how things are, first we have to calm down those ripples, and then we just look and we can see what it is. So there is no ability, there's no reason to kind of create another intellectual idea. Now, since we're all a little bit confused in a way because of our own past karmas and the way that our minds are structured, having some sort of accurate view of reality can help us to align ourselves more and more, so that way we can know what we're doing, even though we might have a lot of frustration. We can say, okay, I know when I'm frustrated I should do this because I read these teachings, yada, yada, yada. And that's all wonderful. And so we should study as well. But ultimately, it's all about getting to that direct experience. And that direct experience will allow you to know the truth for yourself. And the idea too is that we're much more than what we appear. So especially in the beginning, maybe when you're meditating, it's very easy to get bored. You think, okay, I'm just following the breath. There's nothing here. But what you'll actually find if you stick with it is that a lot of these subtleties, there's subtle agitation, and there's like levels of subtle belief systems about reality that also keep you. Because I really believe if you believe there is nothing else, there is nothing else for you. Um, the ability for the mind to kind of project over the actual reality is so strong that this is also too with even people that become schizophrenic or have mental abilities, right? Something's off mentally. They no longer live in reality because that surface of the mind is so strong, but that there's still this nature below that, this Dhamma, this ultimate principle that we can get to and realize for ourselves, and that allows us to find um, the truth of who we are, of reality, to find peace, happiness, and ultimately that there's more destined for us. That this is we're all in this little small part of this very long journey. So I think that's always important to keep in mind. Um, that's pretty much it for what I can think right now off of Dhamma. So now we're going to try to go inside and discover Dhamma for ourselves, try to see what the inner reality is. And so, yeah. So, legs crossed, back straight, neck straight. A couple deep breaths, especially in the beginning. Meditation is really just about learning to relax consciously. Because in the beginning, it usually is a matter of just fighting against these compulsive habits, but there's a stage beyond that. And so, discover that for ourselves, we practice. We close the eyes so we're not distracted by things outside. It allows us our awareness to go inside. And we tie our mind to our breath, because the breath is always with us and it gives us a focal point, something which will always be with us that can allow us to calm the mind down, to train the mind to focus. Because one of the first things you always realize in meditation is that you don't have nearly as much control over your mind as you might think. It might feel like, I think my thoughts, I have this opinion and I have that opinion. In reality, it's not true. The mind itself actually has its own karma that then chooses what arises in the mind. So if you're conditioned to think a certain way because you've done certain things in the past, then those things will come into the mind. And so it's really just kind of another tool. In the same way we see our physical body maybe as a tool, we can also see the mind as a tool, and the emotions as a tool. All these things having their own laws that we can directly observe with our own awareness. You can see in your own mind when certain thoughts come, there's going to be a certain emotional reaction, there's a certain physical reaction. And that physical reaction a lot of times happens with the breath, because the breath and the mind are very closely related. This is why when people feel overwhelmed, they start to hyperventilate and just start breathing so much they start panicking, and then feel like they can't breathe. And that's just as much mental as physical. And so in the same way, when we become very calm, the breath becomes very deep and very smooth. A lot of times in very deep meditation, actually, you can forget that you're breathing at all. It actually feels like breathing completely stops in very, very deep meditation sometimes. There's even, sometimes we talk about absorption meditation. And you call it also like the jhanas. There's different levels of meditation, and one of them is to completely go beyond the senses themselves. That's considered also another very high state of meditation that's attainable. But ultimately, I think we want to be in this state where we have control over our mind, allow the mind to calm down, and then ultimately we can also start to just go into our own body, whatever comes up. But I won't get into that too much right now, because really you can spend a whole lifetime just following the breath, and that's what they do in the Zen tradition. It's just from the beginning time to the end, it's basically just following the breath, and that's all there is. And the idea is eventually the mind becomes so sharp that just with one turn internally, you're able to pierce the veil of illusion. And so for right now, the only thing important to you is the breath. Bare breath. Nothing but breath. A lot of times in meditation, people look for something special, but it's actually the opposite. By being able to just be with mundane, with the breath, with our whatever subtle feelings there are, our mind can start to sink deeper and deeper into meditation. A lot of times it's so subtle, the thing that needs to be addressed or the thing we're reacting to, that we might think, I can't meditate. But there's actually really no such thing as not being able to meditate. It usually means that I'm not experiencing some sort of level of peace that I expect that I should experience because I'm meditating. That when other people meditate, maybe they experience some sort of deep level of equanimity and peace and everything's perfect. And when I go inside and close my eyes, there's no fireworks or something I'm not floating above in some higher godly realm. I'm just breathing like normal, except with my eyes closed, and therefore there can't really be anything special or anything deep and profound here, but you'd be mistaken that in the mundane is where the deep and the profound is. And we can come to terms with just being as we are right now. Start to find some peace. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. Just being aware of the breath. In this moment, there are no responsibilities, no stress. Nothing else is happening except for right now in this moment. Mind is always going into the future, creating hypothetical situations that haven't happened yet. Going into the past, into things that cannot change. The past has already happened, it's gone. And so if we want to master happiness, we want to go deep, we have to do it in this moment, because this moment is all you have. Everything is part of the meditation. If you experience noise, if you experience agitation, if your body feels a certain type of way, good or bad, very happy feeling or feeling sad, all of it is part of the meditation. Something which we're learning to just be with instead of reacting. Being happy and being in the moment are very closely linked. You're really overjoyed or really happy, you'll find that you're thinking about nothing else except for just being in the moment. I mean that not just in meditation, but even in your daily life. You'll find that if you really enjoy eating a certain food, and when you eat that certain food, you become very aware of the present moment. And then most of your happiness is actually coming from being in the present moment. Nothing to fix. Nothing is wrong. Naturally, as the mind calms down and settles down, things become so black and white and so obvious. Life becomes very simple. Many traditional meditation centers, a lot of times, everything is maybe very quiet, no noises, there's no anything. And the reason for this is it becomes easier to meditate, for sure. But the ultimate goal of meditation is to be able to meditate at all times while you're being in the world and maintaining a certain way of being. I consider meditation to be mostly the practice, so us sitting here would be meditation, but ultimately if we're able to not react to whatever stimulus comes and do that in the real world, then we're really accomplishing something. If you're only happy when you're sitting with your eyes closed, you might have a problem. Because what you'll find is the world, all of its issues will come. So what we're really doing is trying to train our mind in such a way that when we go back out into the world, even if there's noise, agitation, you name it, we're able to follow this same pattern, same. The mind itself will already be trained because we spend time training it. It's almost impossible, like let's say you have an anger problem. If someone really does something that makes you very angry in that moment, it's impossible to resist. You'll find that if you are an angry person and you have anger and someone does something that makes you angry, then you'll be angry. But if we're able to sit with ourselves and go inside and allow ourselves to release some of that anger, to be with our own mind and allow it to just kind of unwind as we be aware, maintain our awareness of the breath, then this allows us a new opportunity that if something does come up and it does trigger our anger, maybe less anger is triggered, and then maybe there's also a habit of just observing it. Maybe this allows us to make better decisions, to be happier even in the midst of something where most people may become very unhappy. Because what you find is most people are very attached to everything they own. And if anything that they control or believe is under their control, everything from cars, phones, but also too things they can believe they control, like family. Different members of their family, a lot of people are under the illusion they control the members of their family. But we don't control any of it. We can barely control our minds. And even that we have to work towards. So we can approach all these situations with accepting that this is where things are. Accept our own limitations and forgive others for their limitations. All while getting closer and closer to this thing we call Dhamma. to this deep truth of our own existence and the existence of this reality. All spiritual traditions basically claim and show us that there is a link between our innermost reality and this external reality. There's no randomness anywhere. Everything is due to past karma or past conditions, past choices we made. Many of them now unconscious to us. Conscious mind is such a small part of the overall mind. Whatever our mind overall kind of deems most important for us usually comes to the surface as the thing that needs to be dealt with. Whatever seems most urgent. And as we deal with that thing, whatever that thing might be for us, something else kind of comes, and slowly like this, we work through the karma. We work through our mind and everything that happens. I don't believe in fate per se, but I do believe that for all of us, the amount of control we have over our minds and the level of awareness we have is limited. And that for this reason, all these unconscious karmas, all this unconscious momentum and conditioning does put us on a certain trajectory. It puts us moving in a certain way. And this way in which we are moving could also be seen as our Dhamma. And that the highest principle of us being able to strive for a spiritual way of life and trying to become more aware, and the way that that shows up in our life, that's our individual Dhamma. Our individual calling, you could say, higher calling. And I do believe everyone has one. They are of the mind to follow a spiritual path, which some people choose not to. Also out of ignorance. Buddha talked about how fortunate we are to even hear the teachings of the Buddha, or to know of such things, to know that liberation exists, that there are such things as liberated beings. Even be born a human is considered to be very fortunate. And then to follow the path and everything necessary, because if our minds are too agitated or there's too many issues, it's really not possible to follow a spiritual path which will allow us to gain greater and greater awareness. So it's just that in itself is such a positive karma to have. Good karma. Meditation, if you ever start to feel overwhelmed, you can start to take a couple intentional deep breaths. Usually when we meditate, we want to try to be aware of the breath, the natural breath, without trying to make it longer or shorter, but just be aware of it, which in the beginning especially is quite difficult, because one thing you'll notice about the mind is as soon as your mind becomes aware of the breath, it wants to do something with it. It wants to make it longer or shorter, or perhaps it makes it harder to breathe. Because the mind is always used to reacting to everything. You can't just be with what is until it becomes trained. One of the biggest practices that you have to learn when you start meditating is compassion. Because you'll find that if you start to blame yourself for maybe not meditating good enough, or maybe the mind wanders and there's a feeling of shame or guilt or doing something wrong, all this is going to have to be remedied by a sense of compassion for ourselves, knowing that we're trying, and despite our best efforts, we now have to reset again and focus on the breath. And you'll find that your internal talk can become a little bit softer and softer. Because if that internal dialogue is very judgmental or too harsh, as it oftentimes is, it can make meditation very unbearable, very frustrating. Accepting yourself and all your flaws is such a big part of being able to have compassion and coming to peace with yourself. Unless you're liberated, and even then, I think even liberated people can have certain character, certain very interesting personalities. But that internal state is what we're really striving for. And that not being perfect is perfectly okay. It's perfectly human. Having flaws and having things we like or dislike about ourselves. Something not to condemn ourselves for, but just to accept and see it as it is. And you'll find if you can get to this middle path, this neutral way of looking at it, it'll stop having any sort of pull over you. If you're tall, you're tall. If you're short, you're short. If you're fat, you're fat. If you're skinny, you're skinny. Whatever shape you are, or whatever you believe about that, it only affects you if you can't first admit it to yourself. If you're okay with it, and you're at wherever you're at, you know it's impermanent. You know this body is impermanent, this life is impermanent. We're here for some time. We do our work and then we leave. And that applies to everybody and everything. And so there's no reason to be upset about any of it. It all becomes part of our path. roughly about 5 minutes left. So over those 5 minutes, let's just really try to focus as best we can on the breath, being kind and compassionate to ourselves when it wanders, but keeping the intention to focus. And as we do that, we also relax. It may seem like a paradox to focus and relax at the same time, but in reality, it's not.